Hello, my fellow history geeks, and welcome back to another video. So in today's video is about a serial killer named Bible John. I will warn you guys that there will be mentioning of strangling, blunt trauma, sexual assault, rape, suicide, and sexual demeanor. If you are not comfortable with these mentioning, then please skip this video and watch something else. But if you are somewhat comfortable with these mentionings, then please continue watching. But I have warned you. But anyway, let's dive into today's story. I will start off saying that when I researched about Bible John, there wasn't really much about him. We don't know about his childhood, who his parents are, if he had any siblings. But what we do know is that he went after young women, who was brunette, and that they live in the Glasgow area. Bible John's first victim was a woman named Patricia Docker. So Patricia was the daughter of John Wilson, a Royal Air Force electronics engineer, and his wife Pauline. As a child, she lived in Gloucestershire for a while, and in August 1953 she boarded the P&O troopship Empire Orwell with her mother, where they were bound for Singapore, where Flight Lieutenant Wilson was stationed. They would later move to a larger house in Glasgow. When Patricia was 19, she married a man named Alexander Docker, who was a senior aircraftman with the RAF, where they would have a son named Sandy. The family lived together in Cyprus, where Alex's unit was based. They did also have a babysitter named Janula, who called Patricia a really nice lady. She always used to dress up very nicely. She had described her as the type who would wear skirts, blouses, and a suit. The babysitter recalled beach trips with little Sandy and how she and Patricia loved to watch the TV show Dr. Kildare. They both wanted to be nurses, she said. But the marriage was in trouble. After the Cyprus posting, the couple separated. And in April 1967, Patricia returned to Glasgow, where she became an auxiliary nurse, where she worked nights and split her shifts and took care of her 4-year-old Sandy with her mother. Once a week, Patricia would take a night off from these responsibilities and go dancing. The police report on Patricia's death is written with the same judgmental and misogynistic language that was used to describe all three women. It says that she appears to enjoy the company of men and describes her as an only child and apparently rather spoiled. But what we do know is that she was wearing a mustard knitted dress and a duffel coat with a blue fur collar, and that she would spend the evening dancing at the Majestic Ballroom on Hope Street. But for unknown reason, she had chosen to spend the majority of the evening at the Barrowland Ballroom. We do also know the place where she was found dead in a doorway of a lock-up garage by a man. She was only a few yards away from her home in Langside Place, where her body bore evidence of extensive blunt force trauma, particularly to her face and head. She had been strangled to death with a strong ligature, probably from a belt. Her handbag, watch, and clothes were missing from the crime scene. Her clothes were never found, although her handbag was later recovered from the river cart by an underwater search unit, and her watch was also recovered. It was recovered from a pool of water close to the murder scene. There was a witness who recalled hearing a female scream, yelling, "Leave me alone," the previous evening. A post-mortem was conducted by Gilbert Phobes at the University of Glasgow Medical School, confirmed that the cause of her death had been strangulation, and that Patricia's body no clear evidence of sexual assault. But furthermore, the stage rigor mortis upon her body at the time of the discovery had indicated that she had likely died shortly after she had left the Barrowland Ballroom. The investigators surmised the perpetrator had most likely grabbed Patricia before repeatedly punching her and kicking her in the face as she screamed twice, "To leave me alone," where he would then proceed to strangle her to death, leaving her naked body with nothing but one shoe nearby and close to the doorway of the lock-up garage at Carmichael Place. Bible John's second victim was Yemina, who was 31 at the time of her death. On the night of her death, she had dressed up in a frilly blouse and pinafore dress. She was a regular attendee of the Barrowland. As midnight approached, Yemina was seen by several people in the company of a young, well-dressed and well-spoken man of slim build, aged 25 and 35, and between 6 feet and 6'2", or 183 meters to 188 meters tall. He had dark brown hair with fair streaks, likely spoke with a distinctive Glaswegian accent, and would occasionally insert brief biblical quotations into his conversation. She was last seen walking towards either Main Street or Landrecy Street in the direction of her home at around 12:40 a.m. Margaret, Jamina's sister, started to worry when Yamina didn't come home. Later that same day, she began to hear local rumors that young children had been seen leaving a derelict tenement building in McKeith Street, discussing that there was a body in the premises. And by Monday morning, Margaret was so concerned that she herself, fearing the worst, walked into the old building, where she would discover her sister, Jamina's battered body lying face down with her shoes and stockings lying beside her. A post-mortem concluded that Yamina had been raped and extensively beaten, particularly her face, before she had been strangled to death with one of her own stockings. Her murder had occurred around 30 hours before Jamina's body was discovered. And unlike Patricia, Yamina was fully clothed, although her underclothing had been torn. The police had inquiries into Jamina's movements on the night of her murder, which produced several eyewitnesses who were able to accurately describe the man in whose company she had been seen at the Barrowland. The police went door to door on McKeith Street, also produced a woman who remembered hearing a female scream on the evening of Jamina's murder, although the witness couldn't recall the precise time. Consequently, the police considered this information of little use in their investigation. The police said that her eldest daughter, her name is Elizabeth, who was at that time 11 years old. Yamina also had two sons, named Andrew, who were 8 years old, and Alan, who was 7 years old, and their father, who was said to be West Indian. In the police notes it says, Yamina appeared to be clean in her person and her home, and children were cared for. When Yamina died, the child welfare officials took Elizabeth to one residential care home and her brothers were taken to another. One minute they were a happy family living with their mom, and then the next, they were torn apart. The third and final victim was Helen Gowans Puddock. She was 29 years old. The day they went to Barrowland, Helen had gone to see and bought a black dress with gold buttons up the front. Zhang said that her sister was tall, well-dressed, and that her new dress was lovely. She wore it the night of her murder, along with a fake fur ocelot print coat. Helen had worked on the buses and been a furrier and a bookie. When a romance broke up, she went down to stay with her brother in Reading. That was also there where she met her husband, George Puddock, a lance corporal in the Royal Corps of Signals. They got married in March 1964. The couple had 2 children together, David and Michael, and when George was sent to Germany, his family followed. But Helen didn't like it there and returned to live with her mother in Earl Street, Glasgow, in mid-March 1969. Their marriage was in trouble and Helen had told George that it was over. He then traveled to the city on his next leave from the army on October 17th in the hope that he might win back his wife's affection, but Helen said she didn't love him anymore. The evening of her murder, Helen and Zhang had been to Barrowland Ballroom, where they were both acquainted by 2 men. Both named John. One of them had said that he worked as a slater and resided in Castlemilk, while the other had been a well-spoken man who didn't disclose where he actually lived. After being in the company of these 2 men for more than an hour, all 4 left Barrowland to head home. The man named John, who had been Zhang's dance partner, walked to George Square to board a bus, while Zhang and Helen, and the man, who had been Helen's dance partner, hailed a taxi. So the trio set off from Glasgow Cross, making a 20-minute westward journey toward Langford's Knightswood home. During the trio's conversation in the cab, most of the crucial information pertaining to the killer's psychological profile became apparent. Upon arrival at her home, Zhang exited the cab, leaving Helen and her dance partner still inside. The taxi then continued towards Helen's home in Scottsdown. Zhang then later informed the detectives that her sister, dance partner, had been a teetotal individual who repeatedly quotes from the Old Testament stories of Moses during the time she and her sister had conversed with him in the taxi. He had also referred to the Barrow Land as an adulterous den of iniquity, and of his disapproval of married women visiting the premises, as the quartet had retrieved their coast at the end of the evening. She had exited the taxi at Kelso Street before seeing the vehicle turn towards Earl Street. So the three victims did have something in common. They all had kids, they all went to Barrowland Ballroom, and they were either mid to end 20s and early 30s when they died. And they were also on their period when they got killed. There were a few potential suspects in the Bible John murder case. There were 5 in total. The first suspect is a guy named John Edgar, a junior detective named Liz Brown, who had worked on the Bible John case, had claimed in 2005 that he had identified a likely suspect at the time that he was dismissed simply because his front teeth didn't overlap. John Edgar had been found arguing with a young woman in Barrowland, and the detective said that John resembled the facial composite of Bible John, and that John had given the police a false name and address before he revealed his true name and address in the Gorbals. Several years went by before Detective Brown spoke at length to another detective who had taken the same man to a hospital after arresting him, just outside the Barrowland Ballroom, at the time of the murders. Although the suspect had indeed several stitches in his head following an altercation, as the suspect got released from the handcuffs, he then escaped the hospital. At the time of this incident, this individual had also given the same name John White to the medical personnel. And in addition to this basic circumstantial evidence, that the whole demeanor of the man had led Detective Brown and several of his colleagues to believe that he may have been the perpetrator. After Detective Brown wrote of his suspensions in his 2005 autobiography, this John White guy came forward and offered a DNA sample in order to clear his name. He was then eliminated as a suspect in the Bible John murder case. In 1983, a Lanarkshire contractor named Harry Willey had contacted the police and claimed that his friend David had been the Bible John murderer, that he and David had been raised in the Cranhill district of Glasgow, and that they both had frequented the Barrowland Ballroom in the 1960s. However, Harry had claimed to have read an article in the Evening Times 5 years previously, before he realized that David had been the perpetrator of the murders. And the alleged suspect was traced living in the Netherlands, married to a Dutch woman. Subsequently, the police reportedly quizzed Henderson, and David was eliminated as a suspect too. Jean Langford, who is Helen Gowan's Puttock's sister, told the police that Henderson didn't look like the killer. In the years after the murders, a number of women came forward to claim that they had been sexually assaulted after an evening at the Barrowland. One of these women, named Hannah Martin, had claimed that she had been assaulted and raped by Bible John and had subsequently given birth in January of 1970 to a daughter, who she initially named Isobel. In April of 1969, Hannah had left Barrowland in the company of a tall man with whom she had spicy time with. The tall man then offered Hannah a lift home. However, during the ride home to Hannah's place, the man's sexual demeanor had become aggressive, and Hannah, who was at that time drunk and terrified that she might get attacked, vomited in the man's car. The man then bundled her out of the car and drove off, leaving her standing on the pavement. Hannah's daughter might be directly linked to Bible John. In 1996, Strathclyde police had exhumed the body of John Irvine McCuns from a graveyard in Stonehouse, South Lanarkshire. John Irvine had surveyed in the Scots Guards and died by suicide in 1980. At the age of 41, he died by serving the brachial artery in his upper arm. John Irvine was the cousin of one of the original suspects in the Bible John investigation and related to a senior officer. However, Jean Langford had not picked him out in numerous identity parades, and she continued to insist in 1996 that John Irvine wasn't Bible John. But to be sure, the police took a DNA sample from John Irvine's body for a comparison with the semen examples found in the stockings that belonged to Helen Puttock. The result of the testing conducted proved inconclusive, with then Lord Advocate Lord Mackay stating insufficient evidence that existed to link John Irvine to the murder of Helen Puttock. The Crown had officially cleared John Irvine for any involvement in the Bible John murders in July of 1996. In 2005, the Strathclyde Police and John Irvine's family pathologist confirmed that further advancements in the DNA testing had now enabled a match between John's DNA and the killer's to be fully disproven. The last suspect is Peter Tobin. He had been speculated to be the Bible John killer. He had lived in Shettleston in Glasgow in the late 60s, although he then relocated to England in August 1969. Before the final two murders that were committed by Bible John, after Peter had married his first wife, whom he had met at Barrowland Ballroom in 1968. The amount of violence that he had inflicted on his known victims between 1991 and 2006, and his level of organization didn't suggest the work of an amateur, leading some to believe that he may have killed prior to his first known victims. Peter was known for burying his victims and not leaving them out in public. Unlike Bible John, who left his victims out in public. There are some visual similarities between Peter and Bible John when Peter was in his 20s and the 1969 composite drawing of Bible John. Although the composite drawing showed that Bible John with red hair and the contemporary pictures of Peter show that he didn't have the same hair color. And in addition, all three of Peter's former wives have given accounts of being repeatedly imprisoned, throttled, beaten, and even raped by him. Each had stated that he had been driven to extreme physical violence by the female menstrual cycle. In addition, Peter is known to have been a staunch Roman Catholic with strong religious views. And the alias Bible John may have been given to John Langford and Helen Puttock in 1969 is similar to one of the pseudonyms known to have been regularly used by Peter, John Semple. A criminologist named David Wilson strongly believes that the available evidence supports his theory that Peter is Bible John, although there are some who have criticized his theory. David had also stated that the moment he believed that Peter was Bible John occurred during Peter's trial for the 1991 murder of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol, in which an individual's trial testimony of what Peter had said in the company of herself and McNichol on the evening of McNichol's abduction, which contained notable similarities to things reportedly said by Bible John. There are some important points that overlap. There were both men mentioning they didn't drink at Hogmanay and having a cousin who had once scored a hole-in-one in a golf match. This information, along with other circumstantial evidence, led Wilson to state, "I didn't set out to prove Tobin was Bible John, but I would stake my professional reputation on it." A police investigation named Operation Anagram, which was initiated in 2006 to trace movement of Peter throughout the decades and to determine his potential culpability in any other crimes. It was when a woman informed the investigators that she had been raped by Peter after she had met him at the Barrowland Ballroom in 1968, just shortly after the first of the murders believed to have been committed by Bible John. However, Operation Anagram didn't find any evidence to support the theory that Peter was Bible John. There is a theory about domestic violence of the two murder victims. There are this one crime editor named Jane Hamilton, who has since stated that the detectives whom she has interviewed who had reviewed the Bible John case files in the 1980s, were of the belief that two of the murders linked to Bible John, Patricia Docker and Jermina McDonald, were actually domestic incidents. Patricia's estranged husband, Alex, had been an early suspect in her murder. Patricia and Alex got married in 1963, but their marriage had gradually deteriorated just shortly after a posting to Cyprus, where Patricia is believed to have conducted at least one affair, followed by a brief move to Digby, Lincolnshire, where Alex was an RAF corporal. Patricia then decided to return to Glasgow with their son in April 1967, where she and her son lived with her parents at the time of her murder. Alex, who had claimed to have last seen Patricia at her home in October 1967, when the two had met to discuss divorce, which was considered by the police to have a possible motive to kill his estranged wife. Alex had sought a hasty divorce in order to marry his new partner, with whom he is known to have signed a hotel register on the day after Patricia's murder as husband and wife. And furthermore, investigators had discovered that he had also been on leave from RAF Digby in Scotland at the time of the murder. They were actively contemplating divorce at the time of Patricia's murder, having corresponded about the issue in early 1968. Just shortly after Patricia's murder, Alex had taken their son from his grandparents to live with him and his new partner in Lincolnshire. Yamina MacDonald had also recently separated from her husband at the time of her murder and had likewise moved back to Glasgow the year prior to her death. Her former husband had stated in 2022 that police had considered him as a suspect and that he had been repeatedly questioned regarding her murder. Contemporary police reports indicate that Yamina had visited the Barrowland for 3 successive nights in the week prior to her murder, and that she was in receipt of public funds plus maintenance from the fathers of her children. Reflecting the attitudes of the time Jamina's murder, the press devoted extensive focus on the fact that Jamina's had birthed 3 children by 2 different men. Her 2 youngest with a man who was described as a West Indian and her eldest man who was described as a Yugoslav national with whom she had reportedly become acquainted in Liverpool. There were no further murder victims killed in Scotland or elsewhere in the United Kingdom who have ever been conclusively attributed to Bible John, and the manhunt for this murderer was one of the most extensive manhunts in Scottish criminal history. The murders of the 3 women still remain unsolved, although the case is still open, with many investigators remaining certain that the perpetrator or perpetrators of these crimes were highly likely to have been shielded by one or more individuals whom he had known. There is no uniform consensus that the 3 killings were actually the work of the same person. It has been claimed that the gap of 18 months between the first 2 killings is unusual for a serial killer, and that the later 2 murders may have either been a copycat who had killed or just the sole committed by the same perpetrator. There have also been criticisms leveled against the police for potentially hampering their own investigation by prematurely jumping to the conclusion that all 3 murders had been committed by the same person. In 2004, the police had announced their intentions to genetically test a number of men in a further attempt to identify the perpetrator, with all individuals concerned being requested to submit blood samples. This endeavor followed the previous discovery of an 80% genetic match from the semen samples that were retrieved from the final crime scene. That was attributed to Bible John, with a DNA sample that was retrieved at the site of a minor crime that had been committed just 2 years earlier. The same sample was enough of a match to lead officers to believe that the person who had committed the offense was related to the killer. The sole witness to have engaged in a lengthy conversation with Bible John, John Langford, sadly passed away in September 2010. At the age of 74, Zhang had given the police the description used to form the second composite drawing created of the suspect, which continues to remain the most significant clue as to the perpetrator's physical appearance. But despite Professor Wilson's assertion that Peter Tobin may have been Bible John, when Zhang Langford had discussed her sister's murderer many decades later, she dismissed this theory and stating emphatically that Tobin had not been the man with whom she had shared a taxi with on the night of her sister's murder. Well, this was it for this video. I hoped you enjoyed it. If you have a theory about who it might be, please let me know down in the description box below. I want to know what you guys think about it. And please let me know what you want me to cover in my next video.